Thank you very much for inviting me to the day, and I'm very sorry not to be able to speak in Italian. I'm also sorry that my book is kind of in the design stages, because with each presentation I'm learning something new that I wish I could add to it, but it's too late. I'm going to be talking about how Boetti presented himself, and then how that led to some works which were kind of self-portrait works, and then how that led on to an approach to production. So this, as you know, is the image of his first show in January '67 at the Christian Stein Gallery here in Turin. And if we look at the next slide, you have the first image that I found of Boetti sort of appearing alongside his work. It's a work, one of the handrail Manacorda works, and I think it shows that he's a bit unresolved as to how he wants to appear in the work. Not quite sure what kind of stance to take with it. This isn't a work, it's just a photo of him with a work. But in the next slide, which is only a few, and this is another image that appears later that year. Again, I think he's a little uneasy about how an artist might appear next to their work. This is a lost work called Collina. But this appears at the back of the little catalogue that's already been mentioned, that was published in, I think, October '67, which was on the occasion of his second show, a show that took place in Genoa at the La Bertesca Gallery. At the front of that exhibition catalogue, there was another series of images, if you move on to the next slide, which I think constitutes kind of the first example of him really making a kind of work, or playing with the idea of a self-portrait. It's odd because this is the first published image. The one before of him appearing with the Manacorda wasn't published. This is the first published image. And what kind of an image is this to introduce yourself as an artist? It's a bit like what Christian was talking about before, the artist as the slacker, not working. Well, here we see the artist having a shave. And it's odd that also that the images are presented out of order, so that his moustache kind of goes away and comes back. There are precedents for this work. There's a famous image of Man Ray with his beard half shaved. There's the Duchamp Tonsure work as well. And I think Boetti might have been playing with both of those. But this work, and if you can move on to the next slide, it initiates a series of works that are to do with self-portraiture, but which I would say are mocking the conventions of self-portraiture. So in this work, which is he used in one of the panels for In Sicura Non Curante, he approached a kind of an Italian pop artist, you probably know him, Gallina, and asked him to make a profile, and then he would use this portrait in a number of contexts. One was In Sicura Non Curante, another was a spread that he did in an American catalogue called Formulation, which was his first appearance in America. He was asked to do a sort of an artist project for this catalogue. And he published this image on one side of a double spread. On the other side was a portrait of his ancestor, Giovan Battista Boetti, a man who Boetti believed to have become Sheikh Mansour, the leader of the Chechen people in their resistance to Catherine the Great in the 18th century. The next slide, please. So there are a number of other works which ironize the conventions of the portrait, or of the signature, or data about the artist's work, and so on. This is a work called Due Ghise. You can't quite see it, but it was made by Boetti etching his signature into corrugated cardboard, and then casting that cardboard twice, and then separating the casts. So the signature, which is supposed to be a direct expression of the artist's presence, becomes mediated through several devices, the casting, the repetition, and so on. And I think in works like this, he's thinking back to Manzoni and the critical work that Manzoni did around the conventions of the artist's signature. And next one. I think a really sort of beautiful conceptual work called Nati a Torino. It's another of the panels of In Sicura Non Curante. It's simply a list of people who were born in Turin on the same day as the artist. And I think it's a work which takes on some of the conventions of the biography of the artist and shows how meaningless they are. You know, we often hear catalogue essays beginning with the fact that an artist was born on a certain day in a certain place. And Boetti turns that into the most banal of facts by just showing that he's one of a list of people with this highly incidental biographical information. And next one, please. And a similar type of work in which he gathers all the people in Italy with the same phone number. So a kind of a private piece of information is disclosed but revealed to be completely meaningless. And next one. Okay, so he also plays with his name in some of the earlier Spiro works, rearranging his letters into their alphabetical order, or sometimes spelling out his name in a phonetic way. Now, all these works, which take on the idea of the artist's name, their biographical information, the signature, their image, and so on. There's also the work that Christian showed called Autoritratto, made on a Xerox machine. All these works, I think, have a lot of commonality with other works being made at the time. A lot of artists in the 60s were also attacking conventions of self-portraiture, especially in the States, with people like Robert Morris, who made a work called Self-Portrait, that's a series of brain waves, in fact, taken from a kind of a machine that recorded his thoughts as he was thinking about himself. Or a linguistic work by Mel Bochner called Self-Portrait, where you have two lists of words. One is synonyms of self, the other synonyms of portrait. Most importantly, Bruce Nauman was also making a lot of works at this time, such as My Name, expanded 14 times, where the signature is subject to a number of mediations and inflations. So in this respect, there were a lot of commonalities with what Boetti was doing and what other people were doing. But one strand of his self-portrait works were very, very idiosyncratic and original. And can we move on, please? And again? Okay, and that's the strand in which Boetti presented himself as a sort of split or multiplied figure, a double figure. And they happened in close succession through 1968 and 69. The first being Gemelli, which, as we've heard, was a postcard that was sent out to people. I've always thought that one of the Boettis looks more introspective and the other more outgoing. The next work is called San Bernardino, and it's a work it's called Shaman Showman, and it's a poster that he produced for the first show he had in Milan, which again subsequently became a plate of Insicura non curante, where he took a diagram or an image from a book about the Kabbalah and replaced Adam's head with his own to produce an image of the artist split between the figure immersed in the earth and the figure emerging into the air. And then San Bernardino, hopefully, next slide, in which he appears stretching his arms out, fist, one arm made into a fist, the other made open. I think he's not at all thinking about political symbols at this point. Some people, when I talk about this work, say, oh, did he have in mind the fascist salute and so on? I think what he wanted to do is take recognized political symbols and make them his own thing. So in this case, it was a representation of the artist as totally closed and totally open to the world. And the next one, I won't talk about this actually, but the next one. Okay, and this work, which again I think has a dual nature to it. On the one hand, the artist, well actually more than dual, split in many ways. The artist is a kind of slacker. You also have an impression of this work of a kind of impossibility of portraiture and self-portraiture in an industrial society, because it's so industrial, the materials, the cement of this work, and the repetition you sense here. But you also have the butterfly, which gives the suggestion of a kind of transcendence. So I think this is another work which presents the artist as being many things. Now, I think if you look at the sum of these works in which the artist is presented as a kind of double or split figure, and then ask some questions about what that meant to Boetti, several answers seem possible. On the one hand, we might see these works as a kind of protest about the conflicted position of the artist at this point. So the artist was supposed to be many things. They were supposed to turn up to their openings and be a public figure and be what Boetti called a showman. They were also expected to be a kind of private original genius, a shaman. And I think some people have thought that Boetti here, in these works, wanted to make a protest at the way in which the artist was torn in all these different directions. But I would see them instead as being much more about his ideas of the possibilities of what happens if you have multiple identities as an artist. What happens if you're open and closed? What happens if you're private and public? What happens if you do lots of things at once? Instead of thinking about this in terms of division and a kind of diminution, if we think about them as multiplication, so that all of these cells are multiplying and multiple possibilities arise. There's a rich theoretical landscape that's contemporary with these works to think about them, or to think what we might think of them. At this time, Deleuze and Guattari are working on Anti-Oedipus, in which they're rethinking the figure of the schizophrenic, trying to rescue the schizophrenic from the implication that they're mad, to see the schizophrenic as a kind of rebellious figure, not prepared to accept the strictures of capitalism. But closer to home, Boetti would have known the work of Franco Basaglia and his work with schizophrenics. And if I can just read out one quote from him, I think this says a lot about what attracted Boetti to drawing upon reason and unreason. So this is Basaglia. Until madness itself, stripped of the illness mask through which it has been forced to speak, is reappropriated as the only process of disalienation in a world alienated by technological industrial rationality, it remains powerless. The task is to liberate madness as the only experience that vindicates the right of irrationality against the madness of dominant rationality. And what I take Basaglia to say here is that in retrieving madness, one also makes a case against the dominance of a kind of capitalist ethos and an ethos of constant production. I think some people have already touched on Boetti's resistance to production, resistance to the type of work that goes on in Turin, especially in the 60s. But his attraction to his attraction to schizophrenia, I think, speaks about this other approach to madness that Basaglia wanted to think of. Can you turn to the next slide, please? And the next one. Okay. For me, what then becomes interesting is once Boetti has come up with a kind of theory of the artist as a split figure, as a multiplicitous figure, a figure with multiplicity, how then will that change his approach to production, to making work? And I think what's interesting is that after about 69, more and more, he finds ways to make work using a split production. And it's very important to him that it's not collaboration. Collaboration would imply that he sits down with another person, a fabricator for instance, and discusses carefully how the final work should look. He was working with a much more radical form of split production, where he would come up with some ideas in the work and turn over production to other people, so that the final work would manifest both his authorship and their authorship. In a work like this, for instance, the colours are chosen randomly by the Afghan embroiderers who made the work. He supplies the word I vedenti, which is kind of concealed in dots in the centre of this embroidery. But the precise choices of threads are not his work. In the next work, a biro piece, Anonimo, over the 11 panels of this work, each panel is made by a different person. So when you look at it, you get a powerful sense that there are 11 different authors of this work, with 11 different styles of filling in the sheet. But there's also his authorship, which is the authorship that determines the colour blue, and the word anonimo, another one of his AKAs, his aliases. So in these works, you get this idea of a split production rather than collaboration. You get the input of the people who actually fabricated the work and then his input. And I think where this becomes perhaps most radical and most compelling for us today is in a place like the next work, which is a detail, this work, which is called 720 Letters from Afghanistan, now in the collection of Mumok. And it consists of 720 envelopes sent from Afghanistan, in which 6 stamps are arranged according to all the permutations of that series. And then a book, next slide please, and in the book are bound the 720 letters that had been enclosed in the envelope. Now each letter is a kind of drawing, and the drawing has 2 parts to it. It has a drawing based on the original that Christian showed before, where Boetti was playing with the idea that 1,000 isn't a square number, and to make 1,000 you either have to colour in certain squares of a 32 by 32 square, or you have to add them to a 31 by 31 square. So all the bits at the top of the page, that's Boetti, but the writing at the bottom of the page is, I think it's Golan Dastagir, the person he worked with in Kabul, who set up the One Hotel with him. And you know, here you have a perfect example of split authorship, schizophrenic production perhaps. The idea that the work, some parts of the work are the ideas of Boetti, other parts of the work are the ideas of someone else, but it hasn't been achieved through collaboration and consensus. Rather, the work has these 2 parts to it. And I think what this marks out is the possibilities of what Glissant called the kind of poetics of relation, where different peoples can interweave, different images and different languages can interweave. So in conclusion, I would say that it's the real implications of the work he did with self-portraiture and splitting and doubling and multiplying in 68 and 69 lead on to this approach to fabrication where the artwork becomes handed over to other people whose input is then present in the work alongside his, not just in simple conversation with his, but sometimes in juxtaposition, sometimes interweaving with his. And that's it. Thank you.